Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Auromar Catalina Natural Processed Panama from Wes Ngopi. And there's the bag right there. And Wes Ngopi, based out of Shah, Malaysia. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel quite a bit over the last few weeks. One of the coffees that we purchased from Wes Ngopi recently, this one was the biggest catalyst for that entire purchase, as this coffee caught my interest for a number of reasons. The first and most obvious of which being that it is a Panamanian geisha, and Panamanian geishas are my favorite coffee in the entire world. Combine that with the fact that it is from Auromar, and then in addition to that, we've had such tremendous success with Wes Ngopi's natural processed coffees, and I certainly went into this one with some extremely high expectations, so it'll definitely be interesting to see if this one lived up to those expectations, as this right here is day 58. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. So we have highlighted the fact that Wes Ngopi does skew on the lighter side of things relative to the majority of coffee roasters from Asia that we do review. This one did feel like a slight bit of an exception relative to the other Wes Ngopi coffees that we have reviewed, as it felt like it was a slight bit more developed than them. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that this one was overly developed relative to those coffees, but relative to the experiences that we typically had with them, this one was just a little bit different in general. Even then, I would still align this one with being on the more moderately light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 28, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and there were surprisingly mixed results for this coffee, as interestingly enough, it was the least impressive of the 5 Wes Ngopi coffees that we did try the first time around, as it felt somewhat more traditional and robust relatively speaking, and that's kind of what I'm alluding to when it comes to the profile of this coffee, as it is cleaner, but it feels like it's lacking any specific direction or discernible note to it. Expecting improvement going forward, but as far as a first impression for this coffee goes, it wasn't necessarily the best. Now, I understand I went into this coffee with probably some of the highest expectations that we had for any coffee that we've reviewed over the last couple of years, but even then, I couldn't necessarily understand what to make of that first day, as it really didn't seem to skew specifically in any direction, especially given the expectations I had for the way the coffee was going to turn out. Day 31, through the Chemex, and there were more mixed results as it continues to remain just less defined in general. There is a bit of that robust feel once again without an overly discernible quality to it. We'll hold off on any additional notes until the coffee did open up, as these first 2 days sadly felt like a little bit of a throwaway because I didn't really pull out anything that I felt was worth highlighting within the coffee other than the fact that it just felt a bit lacking in terms of discernibility. Day 34 through the April brewer, and it feels like a very slow climb with this coffee, as it still hasn't opened up or defined itself particularly well, especially off brew. It does require an extended bit of cooldown before it does offer some aspect to it, and this is the first note I came up with, was that it had a blueberry pie-like feel to it with a better combination of clarity and intensity overall, but even then, not anything necessarily worth highlighting. It was very clean for a natural processed coffee from these first couple of impressions, but outside of that, it was clean in a sense where it didn't really have anything to go off of. Day 37, through the V60, and it does appear that the coffee is improving as it's offering a cleaner blueberry aspect pie-like sense once again, with a bit more of a fruit sweetness this time around. A slight grainy quality, but the fermentiness is at a very good place, as it has really nice clarity once again for a natural. I mean, the fermentiness, the funkiness, it's almost non-existent within this coffee, but at the same time, any sort of really strong or intense note is also lacking in that regard too. Day 40 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, so continuing to keep it at our standard recipe, and it continues to remain a very slow climb as the coffee is continuing to improve without any of the grainy or fermenting qualities, but just in general a bit plain, a very just tame blueberry-like feel to it. A bit more citric qualities this time around, a bit more floral qualities, they're all presented in a subdued sense as well, so once again, still nothing too overly discernible within this coffee. Day 43 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it's better again. This coffee just has such a slow climb within it, as It does appear to be the better brew method for this coffee because I do get a slight bit more intensity to it. A dark berry sweetness is presented in a cleaner sense. It's a bit more reminiscent of a washed coffee. I feel like if you served this one with a number of other washed coffees, it might be a bit tricky to pick out which one is the natural, but at the same time, it might just be because it's lacking that intensity that you would also expect from a natural coffee. Lingering citric quality does give it some depth, but even then, it's still just a bit more tame and subdued for what I would expect from this one. Day 46 through the chemics with our standard recipe, and it is having some interesting results this time around as it feels like it has opened up. It's a lot more reminiscent of blueberry pie this time around, a bit more of the lingering florality that does have that jasmine aspect to it. In addition to that, still not fermenty. Still, it's been one of the better days of this coffee up to this point, but it still hasn't quite opened up to the extent that I'm hoping for. Day 49 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and there's more inconsistency as it does have that blueberry pie-like feel to it once again, but it all just continues to present itself in a subtle sense with that complementary jasmine-like florality. Still toned down, still subdued. This coffee still at this moment hasn't necessarily opened up, and it still does continue to remain, I would say, definitely a bit more subdued than I would expect. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a number of level 4s, so let's go through those. We'll start with the cleanliness. Level 4, I feel like one of the most obvious things within this coffee, as I mentioned, there really isn't anything that can kind of take away from the overall cleanliness of it. Okay, at times there's a very slight graininess to it. It's not necessarily the most well-defined, but it's lacking any sort of funkiness, fermentiness that could really take away from this coffee. So level 4 is where we put it, even if it isn't necessarily the most direct coffee. Finish, level 4, it has a bit of a kind of more generic finish to it. It's like I don't want to use this term, but it tastes like coffee the majority of the time. There isn't anything that's particularly well defined about it. I can see a slight bit of a floral finish to it, but even then it's not necessarily the most pronounced. I think if we added an intensity to this tasting wheel and you see that the intensity is probably at a level 2 mark, that might explain and demonstrate why the notes in this one are as high as they are for certain aspects of this coffee. Like the sweetness at a level 4, it's sweet, but it's sweet in the sense that there isn't too much else that I can really experience from this coffee that would go against the overall sweetness of it. So that slight blueberry pie-like feel, it does feel sweeter for what it's worth within this coffee, even if it isn't necessarily the most intense part of this coffee, but the base is just so subdued that notes like that you are experiencing can feel a little bit more pronounced within this coffee, which is why the florality is also there at the level 4. And jasmine-like feel of this coffee is one of the more prominent qualities within this coffee, so it's why it's also scoring there at the level 4. Same thing for the berry fruit and the citric qualities, both of which at that level 4 mark. Blueberry pie is probably the most pronounced thing I could experience within this coffee, and even then it's relatively subdued, and it's something that you experience a lot more as this coffee does cool down. Same thing with the citrus, a slight bit of a lemon-like tone to it, but even then it's still just so subdued relative to the expectations for a natural processed coffee. So level 4 where we put that. Let's move on to the level 3s, just have a couple. Acidity level 3, unsurprisingly, not a lot of brightness. I didn't go into this one expecting a lot of brightness, especially given the other Wes Ngopi coffees weren't offering a ton of brightness to begin with, so toned down in that sense. Stone fruit, level 3, I can feel a slight bit of a peachiness to it, but even then it's still relatively subdued. I mean, if those things were subdued at those level 4s, then you can only imagine how subdued the peachiness was. You really had to kind of seek and try to find any additional notes within this one, that being one of those qualities as well. And then the final thing we're discussing, the body there at the level 2, definitely a lighter bodied cup of coffee, even with it being a natural and a coffee brewed with the V60. So not a whole lot of texture in that sense. So as I am looking at this tasting wheel, not a lot to discuss, but I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I mean, I did go into this one with some of the highest expectations that I've had from any coffee that we've reviewed in quite a while. So it was always going to be really difficult for this coffee to live up to those expectations. But it's such an interesting coffee to me that I couldn't really at any point ever get this one to open up. And I do wonder what honestly happened with this one. And I heard a lot of feedback from others where they said the same thing. This coffee just seemed to be so obscure right from the onset, and they couldn't really seem to get too much out of this coffee. And I even got to descriptors of stuff like, I want to say tobacco, or just a little bit more of a generic traditional feel to it. And I can see that because that was a lot of what I experienced from the earlier days, but nothing that was overly definitive, pronounced, or well defined to the point where I said it's a bit generic coffee tasting. So that's why I didn't really want to highlight any of those notes early on. But then towards the end, it continued to remain that way, with the coffee just ever so slightly opening up for the majority of the time. And we do have a fair bit of this coffee left, not because I didn't necessarily want to drink it, but mostly because I wanted to see what would happen with this coffee. I don't think it's going to open up more than it actually did. There might be a little bit more intensity to it from this point going forward, but even then, I think that this coffee had a weirdly low ceiling for what this coffee was going into it. And this is probably the best way I could get this coffee to present itself. So make of that what you will. Obviously, it didn't live up to some very high expectations that I did have. I just really wonder what happened with this one. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. It makes for a very tricky recommendation as well. I feel like if you're looking for a challenge, and this coffee is a very good one for that, because it does have some nice qualities to it. I just didn't see the potential where I could have gotten more out of it than what I did. Like, there is that blueberry-like quality to it. There is that very subtle citric quality. There is that very subtle floral quality. And even then, I feel like at max, I'm able to get a bit more intensity out of those, but I don't think that you can really pull out much more from this coffee than what it is. I think it's just meant to be this way, a little bit more tame, subdued, and delicate in general. So if that's the type of coffee you'd like, that's the best direction I can point you towards in this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd definitely love to know your thoughts and impressions of it, this one as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been your review of the Auromar Catalina natural processed Panama from Wes Ngopi. Thank you for watching.